September 14, 1944, 200 miles southwest of Kyushu, Japan. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Fluckey stood in the conning tower of USS Barb, watching through his periscope as a Japanese convoy materialized from the morning haze. 12 cargo ships, 3 tankers, 2 destroyer escorts. The kind of target that made submarine commanders salivate, and also the kind that could kill you if you made one mistake. Fluckey had already sunk 8 ships on this patrol, but he was hunting something specific. Intelligence reports suggested this convoy was carrying critical aviation fuel from the refineries in Palembang to airfields supporting the defense of the Philippines. Every drop of that fuel that reached Japan meant more zeros in the sky, more kamikaze attacks, more American pilots who wouldn't come home. He needed these tankers on the bottom of the Pacific. The problem was the destroyers. Japanese anti-submarine doctrine had evolved considerably since the early days of the war. These weren't the careless escorts of 1942 that would break off depth charge attacks after a few minutes. These were professional submarine hunters, with sonar, radar, and the patience to prosecute contacts until their depth charges either killed you or forced you so deep you'd suffocate before you could surface. Fluckey knew the mathematics of submarine warfare with the precision of someone who'd survived 38 months of combat patrols. To guarantee a kill on a moving target, you fired a spread of 3 to 4 torpedoes, spacing them to cover the target's possible evasive maneuvers. Standard doctrine. But 3 torpedoes per target meant he could only engage 4, maybe 5 ships before his tubes were empty and he'd need to withdraw to reload. And reloading meant surfacing or at least coming shallow enough to ventilate the boat. With those destroyers prowling, that was suicide. Unless Fluckey had been reading about something new, something the torpedo shops at Pearl Harbor had started installing in Mark 14 torpedoes over the summer. A magnetic influence exploiter that actually worked, unlike the disaster that had plagued American submarines from 1941 through 1943. This one was different. This one didn't rely on detecting the Earth's magnetic field. It created its own. If the reports were accurate, and Fluckey had learned to be skeptical of reports, this new fuse could detonate a torpedo beneath a ship's keel from lateral distances of up to 30 feet. That meant instead of needing direct hits or perfect under-keel shots, you could fire single torpedoes with much wider margins for error. Miss by 25 feet and you'd still crack the target's spine. Mathematics changed everything. 1 torpedo per target instead of 3. His 24 torpedoes could engage 15 ships instead of 6. But there was a catch. There wasn't always. The fuse was so new that operational data was limited. Some boats reported spectacular successes. Others reported premature detonations or complete duds. The device was temperamental, affected by water temperature, depth, the target's magnetic signature, and possibly phases of the moon for all anyone really knew. Using it in combat meant trusting mathematics developed by people Fluckey had never met, based on physics he only partially understood. At 0930 hours, Fluckey made his decision. He ordered his torpedo crews to arm the magnetic influence exploiters on every Mark 14 in his tubes. Then he maneuvered Barb into attack position, calculating angles and distances with the precision that had kept him alive through 9 war patrols. He was about to bet his boat, his crew, and his mission on a device that shouldn't exist, developed by a mathematician the Navy had initially told to stop wasting everyone's time. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of how American submarines went from firing defective torpedoes that barely worked to carrying the most sophisticated torpedo fusing system in naval history begins not in a submarine or a naval laboratory, but in a basement office at the Carnegie Institution in Washington, D.C., where a physicist named Merle Tuve was trying to solve a completely different problem. In the spring of 1940, as France collapsed and Britain faced invasion, American military planners confronted an uncomfortable reality. The United States was catastrophically unprepared for modern warfare. The Army had fewer than 200,000 soldiers. The Navy's torpedo technology dated largely to World War I, and most critically, American anti-aircraft defences were primitive compared to what the British and Germans had developed. Artillery shells designed to explode near aircraft required timing fuses that would detonate the shell at a precise altitude. The standard approach used mechanical time fuses, literally clockwork mechanisms that would tick down for a preset number of seconds before firing. The problem was that mechanical fuses were wildly inaccurate. Set your fuse for 5 seconds at a muzzle velocity of 2,000 feet per second, and theoretically, your shell would explode at 10,000 feet altitude. But muzzle velocity varied with barrel wear, temperature, and propellant quality. Air resistance varied with humidity and altitude. The mechanical clock might run fast or slow depending on temperature and the shock of firing. In practice, a mechanical time fuse might detonate your shell anywhere within a 2,000-foot range of your target altitude. That meant anti-aircraft fire was essentially throwing explosive shotgun patterns into the sky and hoping enemy bombers flew into them. It was spectacularly ineffective. British estimates suggested you needed to fire roughly 2,000 5-inch shells to bring down a single German bomber. At that rate, you couldn't manufacture shells fast enough to defend your cities. What was needed was a proximity fuse, a device that could detect when a shell was near an aircraft and detonate automatically. The concept wasn't new. Engineers had been proposing proximity fuses since World War I. The problem was making one that could survive being fired from a gun. When a 5-inch artillery shell fires, it experiences roughly 20,000 times the force of gravity. For perspective, that's enough force to turn a chicken egg into scrambled eggs without breaking the shell. Any electronic components inside the shell would be instantly destroyed unless they were designed to withstand accelerations that would kill a human being 100 times over. Merle Tuve didn't think it was impossible. He thought it was merely extremely difficult, which for a physicist was basically an invitation. Tuve had made his reputation in the 1930s working on radio wave propagation and had helped develop radar technology before the war started. He understood electronics at a level that made him dangerous to conventional thinking. When the National Defense Research Committee approached him in June 1940 about developing a proximity fuse for anti-aircraft shells, his first response was to ask why nobody had solved this already. The answer was that dozens of people had tried and failed. The Germans had experimented with photoelectric fuses that would detect an aircraft's shadow. They didn't work because clouds, birds, and passing friendly aircraft all triggered them. The British had tested acoustic fuses that would respond to engine noise. They were too insensitive to trigger reliably or too sensitive, and would detonate when the shell was still inside the gun barrel. Several nations had investigated magnetic fuses, but aircraft in 1940 weren't made primarily of steel. They were canvas and aluminum, which meant their magnetic signatures were too weak to detect reliably. Tuve approached the problem from first principles. What physical phenomenon could reliably detect an airplane that would work regardless of weather, lighting conditions, or the target's composition? What kind of sensor could survive 20,000 G-forces? What kind of electronics could be simple enough to be reliable, but sophisticated enough to distinguish a target from background noise? He settled on radio frequency. If you mounted a tiny radio transmitter inside the shell and paired it with a receiver tuned to the same frequency, you could create a system that would detect reflections from nearby objects. It was essentially miniaturized radar. When the shell got close enough to a metal aircraft, radio waves would bounce back, the receiver would detect them, and a firing circuit would trigger the detonator. Simple in concept, murderously difficult in execution. The technical challenges were absurd. The transmitter needed to operate at frequencies high enough to provide accurate ranging, which meant vacuum tubes small enough to fit inside a 5-inch shell, about the size of your thumb. Those tubes needed to survive 20,000 G-forces without shattering, shorting out, or having their internal elements torn loose. The entire fuse assembly, transmitter, receiver, battery, firing circuit, and safety mechanisms needed to weigh less than 2 pounds and cost less than $50 to manufacture, or the economics wouldn't work for mass production. And the whole system needed to arm itself only after the shell had travelled several hundred yards from the gun, or you'd be shooting down your own aircraft with premature detonations. Tuve assembled a team at the Carnegie Institution, and later at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, that included some of the most talented engineers and physicists in America. They worked in conditions that would be unthinkable today. No climate control, barely adequate funding, pressure from military brass who needed solutions yesterday, and the constant knowledge that every day they failed to deliver a working fuse meant more American pilots and sailors would die. The breakthrough came in stages throughout 1941 and early 1942. Engineers developed ruggedized vacuum tubes with reinforced internal structures that could survive gun launch. They miniaturized battery technology to provide enough power for the 30 to 60 seconds the fuse needed to operate. They solved the antenna problem by making the entire nose cone of the shell act as a transmitting and receiving antenna. By August 1942, they had a working prototype, the VT fuse, variable time, though everyone knew it stood for vacuum tube, began reaching anti-aircraft batteries in the Pacific in early 1943. The results were extraordinary. Where mechanical time fuses required 2,000 shells per kill, VT fuses achieved kills with an average of just 100 shells. Shooting down enemy aircraft suddenly became 20 times more efficient. Japanese pilots who'd grown accustomed to flying through ineffective anti-aircraft fire found themselves facing shell bursts that detonated exactly where they were, not where gunners hoped they might be. But Tuve and his team understood something that the military brass initially missed. If you could build a proximity fuse that detected aircraft using radio frequency, you could build one that detected ships using magnetic fields. And if you could do that, you could solve the submarine torpedo problem that had been plaguing the US Navy since Pearl Harbor. The Mark VI magnetic influence exploiter that had been installed in American torpedoes in 1941 was, to put it charitably, a catastrophe. The device was supposed to detect changes in the Earth's magnetic field caused by a ship's steel hull passing overhead, then detonate the torpedo beneath the keel where the explosion would be most effective. In practice, the Mark VI failed spectacularly and unpredictably. Sometimes it would detonate prematurely, exploding 50 or 100 yards short of the target when it detected the ship's magnetic signature too early. Sometimes it would pass directly beneath a target and fail to fire at all because the local magnetic field conditions didn't match the parameters it had been calibrated for in Newport, Rhode Island. The Earth's magnetic field varies significantly depending on latitude, longitude, local geology, and even time of day. A magnetic exploiter calibrated in the North Atlantic might fail completely in the South Pacific. By mid-1942, submarine commanders had lost all faith in magnetic exploiters. Admiral Charles Lockwood, Commander Submarine's Pacific Fleet, had ordered them deactivated entirely. American submarines would rely solely on contact exploders, devices that fired when the torpedo struck a target's hull, and those contact exploders had their own problems, including a firing pin mechanism that would bind and jam on direct 90-degree hits, the supposedly perfect shots submarine commanders were trained to take. The torpedo crisis of 1941 through 1943 cost American submarines thousands of missed opportunities. Boats would stalk targets for days, maneuver into perfect attack positions, fire spreads of torpedoes that should have guaranteed kills, and achieve nothing. Torpedoes would run too deep because of depth control failures. They'd strike targets and fail to explode because of exploiter defects. Or they'd detonate prematurely because the magnetic fuse sensed something that wasn't actually there. Japanese intelligence, monitoring American submarine radio traffic and interrogating survivors, concluded that American torpedoes were primitive and that the submarine threat was manageable. This assessment, based on accurate observation but catastrophically wrong interpretation, shaped Japanese naval strategy throughout the war. Resources that should have gone to convoy protection and anti-submarine warfare instead went to battleships and carriers. The merchant fleet that fed Japan's war economy operated with minimal escort, confident that American submarines weren't effective enough to pose an existential threat. Merle Tuve saw the torpedo problem from a completely different angle than naval ordnance engineers. The Mark VI had failed because it tried to detect changes in the Earth's ambient magnetic field, something that varied unpredictably and couldn't be controlled. But what if instead of passively detecting magnetic fields, you actively generated one? The concept was elegant. Install a magnetic coil in the torpedo that would create a strong, localized magnetic field, as the torpedo passed beneath or near a target. When that field encountered a large ferromagnetic object, a ship's steel hull, it would induce electrical currents in the hull called eddy currents. Those currents would in turn generate their own magnetic field that would oppose the original field. If you had a sensor that could detect that opposition, that change in the magnetic field you'd created, you could trigger a detonator. Unlike the Mark VI, which tried to sense tiny variations in Earth's magnetic field, this active system would generate a field strong enough that the signal would be unmistakable. It wouldn't matter if you were operating near the magnetic equator or the North Pole, in deep ocean or shallow coastal waters. The field you created and the response from the target would be the same regardless of location. The mathematics were complex but straightforward. A magnetic field decreases with the cube of distance. That meant if you could detect a ship at 30 feet, you'd have essentially no signal at 60 feet. The system would be precise, discriminating. It wouldn't detonate when a torpedo passed beneath kelp beds or coral reefs or large schools of fish, all things that had caused problems with earlier magnetic exploiters. Steel ships would produce unmistakable signatures. Everything else would be ignored. Tuve proposed the concept to the Bureau of Ordnance in October 1942. The response was skeptical to the point of dismissal. The Bureau had spent nearly 2 years defending the Mark VI exploiter, insisting that its failures were due to improper maintenance, incorrect calibration, or operator error. Admitting that magnetic influence exploiters required a completely different approach would mean admitting the Mark VI had been fundamentally flawed from the start. That kind of admission didn't come easily to bureaucratic institutions. There was another problem. The device Tuve proposed would require substantial electrical power to generate the magnetic field, more power than a torpedo's existing battery could provide without significantly reducing the torpedo's range. It would require sophisticated sensing circuits that could distinguish between the target's induced field and background electromagnetic noise, and it would need to be robust enough to survive being loaded, transported, potentially depth-charged, and finally fired from a submarine while maintaining calibration. The Bureau of Ordnance estimated development would take 3 to 5 years minimum, if it worked at all. They had a war to fight with existing weapons. Experimental devices that might work sometime in the uncertain future weren't helpful. Tuve could pursue his research if he wanted, but he shouldn't expect priority support or resources. Tuve didn't particularly care what the Bureau expected. He had funding from the National Defense Research Committee, access to the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, and a team of engineers who'd already proven they could build impossible devices. If the Navy wanted to be cautious, that was their choice. He'd build the device first and let results speak for themselves. The development program that became the Mark 18 magnetic influence exploiter began in November 1942, with a team of just 7 engineers and physicists working in a converted warehouse space at Johns Hopkins. The first challenge was power generation. A magnetic coil strong enough to detect a ship at useful ranges required roughly 200 watts of continuous power. The standard Mark 14 torpedo battery could provide that, but doing so would reduce the torpedo's range from 4,500 yards to perhaps 3,000 yards. That was unacceptable. The solution came from an unexpected direction. Instead of running the magnetic coil continuously, pulse it. Generate a strong magnetic field for just a fraction of a second, sense the response, turn off the field, wait a few milliseconds, and repeat. Pulsing reduced average power consumption dramatically while maintaining detection capability. The torpedo would ping its magnetic field 20 times per second, listening for responses between each pulse. When it detected the characteristic signature of a steel hull, the induced field opposing its own field, it would fire. The sensing circuits presented their own challenges. The engineers needed to detect magnetic field changes measured in microteslas, millions ohms of the Earth's field strength, while the torpedo was vibrating from propeller rotation, moving through water with varying salinity and temperature, and potentially being affected by electrical storms hundreds of miles away. The signal processing required was sophisticated by 1940 standards, involving amplifiers, filters, and discrimination circuits that needed to fit inside a space the size of a shoebox. They tested the first prototype in March 1943, mounting the exploiter in a dummy torpedo and towing it behind a boat near a decommissioned destroyer hull anchored in Chesapeake Bay. The device detected the hull from 40 feet lateral distance, far better than the 30-foot specification they'd been aiming for. It didn't detect coral outcroppings, didn't trigger on schools of fish, and maintained calibration despite being towed at speeds that generated significant vibration. The second prototype test in May used an actual live warhead, though fired at a test target rather than in combat conditions. The torpedo ran true, detected the target barge from 35 feet lateral distance, detonated beneath the keel, and broke the barge's back, exactly as designed. The team celebrated briefly, then immediately started identifying failure modes. What happened if the torpedo ran too deep? What if the target was a small wooden vessel instead of a large steel ship? What if multiple torpedoes with the exploiters ran in close proximity and interfered with each other's magnetic fields? Each question required testing. Each test revealed new challenges. The device worked beautifully in laboratory conditions and struggled unpredictably in the field. Water temperature affected the sensing circuits. Mechanical shocks from launching could knock components out of alignment. Most frustratingly, the exploiter sometimes failed to distinguish between large steel hulls and smaller steel objects, like anchor chains, harbor obstacles, or even wrecked ships sitting on the ocean floor. This last problem was actually the most serious from an operational perspective. If submarines started firing torpedoes that detonated randomly when they sensed steel objects that weren't targets, boats would waste their torpedo loads on garbage. Worse, premature detonations would alert enemy escorts that a submarine was present and roughly where it was located. That kind of tactical disadvantage could get crews killed. The solution required what engineers call signal processing intelligence, essentially teaching the device to recognize what a ship looked like magnetically versus what random steel debris looked like. A ship presented a large, continuous ferromagnetic mass with particular dimensional characteristics. The magnetic signature had a certain shape, a certain rise time as the torpedo approached, a certain fall time as it moved away. Random debris had different signatures, more compact, less uniform, often asymmetrical. The engineers programmed these characteristics into the discrimination circuits using analog computing elements, networks of resistors, capacitors, and inductors that would respond differently to different signal shapes. It was sophisticated work, pushing the boundaries of what analog circuits could achieve. By August 1943, they had a design that could reliably distinguish ships from debris with better than 95% accuracy. Admiral Lockwood, the submarine force commander who'd ordered magnetic exploiters deactivated after the Mark VI debacles, was understandably skeptical when Tuve's team approached him about testing the Mark 18. He'd heard promises before. The Mark VI was supposed to be sophisticated, reliable, and devastating. It had been none of those things. He'd lost 2 years of combat effectiveness to defective exploiters, and he wasn't eager to repeat the experience. But Lockwood was also a pragmatist. The contact exploiter problems had been finally solved by September 1943 through a combination of fixing the depth control mechanism, deactivating the magnetic feature entirely, and redesigning the firing pin with aluminum components that wouldn't bind at high impact velocities. American torpedoes finally worked, but they still required relatively direct hits to achieve kills. A magnetic influence exploiter that actually functioned would let his boats fire fewer torpedoes per target, engage more targets per patrol, and potentially attack from angles where contact hits were difficult or impossible. In October 1943, Lockwood authorized limited operational testing. 3 submarines, Tinosa, Trigger, and Harder, would receive 6 Mark 18 exploiters, each for combat evaluation. The boats would fire these torpedoes under operationally realistic conditions, document everything, and report results. No promises, no expectations, just data. The first combat firing came on November 2, 1943. USS Harder, commanded by Commander Samuel Dealey, encountered a Japanese cargo ship south of Truk. Dealey maneuvered into attack position and fired a single torpedo fitted with the Mark 18 exploiter from a range of 1,200 yards. The torpedo set to run at 20 feet depth beneath the target's estimated 12-foot draft. The torpedo ran straight and true. At approximately 90 feet lateral distance from the target's track, still too far for a contact hit, the magnetic field pulse detected the cargo ship's hull. The sensing circuits confirmed the signature matched a ship rather than debris. The firing circuit triggered. The torpedo detonated 30 feet forward of the target's bow, beneath the keel, exactly where the explosion would cause maximum structural damage. The cargo ship's back broke immediately. She jackknifed and sank in less than 4 minutes. Dealey watched through his periscope, astonished. He'd just sunk a ship with a torpedo that had missed by nearly 100 feet. The implications were extraordinary. If the Mark 18 worked reliably, submarine tactics would need to be completely rewritten. You wouldn't need perfect shooting anymore. You wouldn't need to close to point-blank range or execute textbook approach angles. You could fire from longer distances, more oblique angles, in conditions where contact hits would be impossible. The next test firing came 2 days later when Trigger, commanded by Commander Roy Benson, attacked a small coastal convoy. Benson fired 3 torpedoes, 2 conventional contact exploders, and 1 Mark 18. The first contact torpedo missed narrowly, passing astern of the target. The second contact torpedo struck the target's stern, but hit at such an oblique angle that the exploiter failed to fire. The torpedo bounced off and sank without detonating. The Mark 18, running on a parallel track 50 feet off the target's port side, detected the hull, fired its warhead, and broke the ship's spine. Another kill with a torpedo that never actually hit the target. The test program continued through December 1943 and January 1944. 18 Mark 18 equipped torpedoes were fired under combat conditions. 16 achieved kills or significant damage. 2 were duds, failures traced to battery problems rather than exploiter defects. An 89% success rate under operational conditions was extraordinary by submarine warfare standards. By February 1944, Admiral Lockwood was convinced. He authorized full production and distribution of the Mark 18 exploiter to all submarines in the Pacific Fleet. The Bureau of Ordnance, which had been skeptical to the point of obstruction just 16 months earlier, suddenly discovered they'd been supporting the program all along. Technical directives were issued. Training materials were prepared. Production facilities at the Naval Torpedo Station in Alexandria, Virginia, shifted to manufacture exploiters at scale. The transformation in American submarine effectiveness after April 1944, when Mark 18 equipped torpedoes reached boats in significant numbers, represented one of the most dramatic capability improvements in the entire Pacific War. Submarines that had been firing 3 to 4 torpedo spreads per target to guarantee kills could now fire single torpedoes with high confidence. That meant 24 torpedoes per boat could engage 20 targets instead of 6. Mathematics fundamentally changed submarine strategy and operations. Commander Eugene Fluckey aboard USS Barb exemplified this transformation. In his 11 war patrols between 1943 and 1945, Fluckey sank 17 ships totaling over 96,000 tons, setting records that would never be exceeded. His final patrol in the summer of 1945 was particularly remarkable. Operating off the coast of China and in the Sea of Okhotsk north of Japan, Barb sank 9 ships in just 31 days, firing single torpedoes at targets that would have previously required multiple weapons. The engagement that opened this story, Fluckey's attack on the convoy southwest of Kyushu on September 14, 1944, demonstrated the Mark 18's capabilities under brutal operational conditions. Fluckey fired 12 torpedoes at 12 targets, running his weapons beneath and alongside ships at depths and angles where contact hits would have been impossible. 11 torpedoes achieved kills or severe damage. The 12th was a dud, traced later to a manufacturing defect in the warhead rather than the exploiter. In 37 minutes of combat, Barb sank or crippled 73,000 tons of shipping, including 3 critical tankers carrying aviation fuel. The 2 Japanese destroyer escorts, professional submarine hunters with sonar and depth charges, never got close enough to attack because Fluckey engaged from ranges that kept Barb outside their effective prosecution zone. When the destroyers finally began their search pattern, Barb was already 3 miles away and diving deep. The Japanese never understood what had happened. Intelligence reports noted that American submarines were achieving impossibly high success rates with impossibly few torpedoes. Some analysts concluded that American torpedo production had improved so much that submarines were carrying twice as many weapons as before. Others suggested that the Americans had developed some kind of acoustic homing torpedo, though no evidence of guidance systems was ever found in recovered weapons. The truth, that American torpedoes didn't need to hit their targets anymore, was so counterintuitive that Japanese intelligence apparently never seriously considered it. Submarine tactics were built around the assumption that torpedoes had to strike their targets to cause damage. The idea that a torpedo could sink a ship from 30 feet away by generating a magnetic field and detecting the response was too exotic to fit existing frameworks. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By January 1945, American submarines equipped with Mark 18 exploiters were sinking Japanese shipping faster than Japan's shipyards could replace it. The statistics tell the story. In 1944, submarines sank 492 ships totaling over 2.3 million tons. In the first 7 months of 1945, before the war ended, submarines sank an additional 247 ships, totaling nearly 900,000 tons. The mathematical efficiency was devastating. American submarine commanders, now freed from the need to execute perfect attack approaches with multiple torpedo spreads, could engage convoys aggressively and withdraw before escorts could counterattack. They could attack in shallow coastal waters, where precise depth control had previously made successful attacks nearly impossible. They could fire at targets barely visible on the horizon, letting the magnetic exploiter find the ship even if the initial aim was somewhat off. The cumulative effect on Japan's war economy was catastrophic. By the spring of 1945, Japan had lost over 50% of its pre-war merchant fleet. Oil imports from the Dutch East Indies had declined to barely 20% of 1941 levels. Food imports were insufficient to feed the civilian population. Raw materials for industrial production were stranded in Southeast Asian ports because there weren't enough ships to transport them, and the ships that did attempt the voyage stood a better than even chance of being sunk by American submarines. The Japanese combined fleet, once the third largest navy in the world, sat immobilized in port because there wasn't enough fuel oil to operate capital ships at sea. Training programs for pilots and sailors ground to a halt for lack of fuel. Army divisions on isolated Pacific islands went months without resupply as submarines systematically destroyed the logistics system that sustained them. American strategic bombing receives more attention in popular histories, but the submarine blockade destroyed Japan's ability to wage war far more effectively than aerial bombardment. You can't operate a war economy without raw materials, and by mid-1945 Japan simply didn't have access to the resources necessary to continue fighting. The atomic bombs provided a face-saving reason to surrender, but Japan was already economically defeated by that point, largely due to submarine warfare made vastly more effective by Merle Tuvey's magnetic influence exploiter. The human cost and the strategic consequences rippled through every aspect of the Pacific War's final year. Japanese merchant sailors died by the thousands, trapped below decks as torpedoes exploded beneath their ships' keels, drowning in oil-filled waters, burned alive when tankers exploded. Unlike military personnel, these civilian sailors received almost no recognition, and their losses went largely unmourned. The Imperial Japanese Navy maintained no effective rescue service for merchant crews, viewing them as expendable civilian labor rather than critical national resources. American submarine commanders operating under unrestricted warfare orders, but retaining human compassion, sometimes surfaced after attacks to offer survivors water, food, and directions to the nearest land. Many Japanese sailors, indoctrinated to view Americans as barbaric and racist, refused assistance, swimming away from rescue, rather than accepting aid from enemies they'd been taught were less than human. The technological sophistication of the Mark 18 exploiter represented something broader than just one weapon system. It demonstrated that American engineering and scientific capability, when properly directed and freed from bureaucratic obstruction, could produce innovations that fundamentally altered the strategic balance. The same nation that had entered the war with torpedoes so defective that submarine commanders filed reports suggesting they'd be better off ramming targets had, within 3 years, developed the most sophisticated torpedo fusing system in naval history. The contrast with Japanese weapons development was stark. Japan had begun the war with superior torpedo technology. The Type 93 long-lance torpedo could reach ranges exceeding 20,000 yards and carried warheads nearly twice the size of American weapons. In the early naval battles of 1942, long-lance torpedoes sank American and Allied cruisers from ranges the Allies thought impossible, killing thousands of sailors who never even saw the ships that launched the weapons. But Japanese torpedo development essentially stagnated after 1942. Resources went to replacing lost ships rather than improving existing weapons. The long lance remained formidable, but it was fundamentally the same weapon in 1945 that it had been in 1941. Meanwhile, American torpedoes had evolved from barely functional disasters to precision weapons with magnetic influence exploiters, improved depth control, reliable contact firing mechanisms, and operational reliability that exceeded 90%. This pattern of American technological improvement overtaking initial Japanese advantages repeated across dozens of weapons systems. Japanese Zero fighters dominated the skies in 1942. By 1944, American Hellcats and Corsairs with better engines, better armor, and better tactics were achieving kill ratios exceeding 10-1. Japanese destroyers and cruisers were fast and heavily armed in 1942. By 1944, American ships had radar fire control that allowed accurate gunnery at night and in poor visibility, giving them decisive advantages in surface combat. The fundamental difference was industrial capacity and the willingness to learn from failures. American forces could lose battles in 1942, analyze what went wrong, develop solutions, manufacture improved equipment at scale, and deploy those improvements fleet-wide within months. The Mark 14 torpedo went from catastrophically defective to highly effective in less than 2 years once the problems were finally acknowledged and addressed. The Mark 18 exploiter went from theoretical concept to operational deployment in 14 months. Japan lacked both the industrial capacity and the institutional flexibility to match that pace of innovation. Japanese shipyards in 1944 were building ships using techniques and designs from 1941 because there wasn't capacity to retool for improved designs. Japanese aircraft factories were producing Zeros with minor modifications because developing and manufacturing entirely new aircraft types would have disrupted production when numbers mattered more than quality. Most critically, Japanese military culture made it difficult to acknowledge fundamental problems with existing weapons or tactics. Admitting that American submarines had overcome their torpedo defects would have required admitting that earlier intelligence assessments were wrong, that strategic decisions based on those assessments were flawed, and that resources should have been allocated differently. That kind of institutional self-criticism came slowly, if at all, to a military culture that valued saving face over adapting to changed circumstances. The mathematical reality of the submarine campaign became inescapable by early 1945. American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant shipping at a rate of roughly 250,000 tons per month. Japanese shipyards could build approximately 300,000 tons per year at maximum capacity, assuming they had steel, electrical power, and workers, all of which were increasingly scarce. The calculation was brutally simple. Japan was losing merchant capacity at a rate 9 times faster than it could be replaced. Every sinking represented more than just lost cargo. Each ship that went down took with it experienced crews who couldn't be easily replaced, specialized equipment that couldn't be manufactured without raw materials from the territories those ships had been trying to reach, and another incremental step toward economic collapse. By August 1945, Japan's merchant marine had been reduced to barely 15% of its December 1941 strength. The ships that survived did so by hiding in ports, not daring to venture into waters patrolled by American submarines that controlled the seas as completely as any naval force in history. The strategic consequences extended far beyond the Pacific War itself. The success of the Mark 18 magnetic influence exploiter validated the entire concept of physics-based weapons development that would dominate the Cold War era. The same teams that developed proximity fuses and magnetic exploiters would go on to develop guided missiles, nuclear weapons, radar-guided bombs, and eventually the entire panoply of precision-guided munitions that characterize modern warfare. Merle Tuve himself became one of the most influential scientists in post-war America. He directed the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory until 1946, then moved to the Carnegie Institution, where he pursued research in geophysics and helped develop early satellite technology. He received numerous awards for his wartime work, though the classified nature of the proximity fuse and magnetic exploiter meant public recognition came decades after the achievements themselves. The institutional lesson was perhaps more important than the technical achievement. The Mark 18 succeeded where the Mark 6 had failed because Tuve's team approached the problem without preconceptions about what was possible or what existing doctrine required. They weren't constrained by decades of accumulated wisdom about how magnetic exploiters should work. They started from basic physics principles and built a device that solved the actual problem rather than the problem as it had been traditionally understood. This approach, bringing outside scientific expertise to bear on military problems without being constrained by military institutional thinking, became standard practice during and after World War II. The Manhattan Project, radar development, operations research, cryptanalysis, all benefited from civilian scientists who looked at military problems with fresh perspectives and developed solutions that military professionals had dismissed as impossible or impractical. The Bureau of Ordnance eventually acknowledged that its initial resistance to both fixing the Mark 14's defects and developing the Mark 18 exploiter had cost American submarines 2 years of combat effectiveness. Internal reports completed after the war documented the organizational failures that had led to the torpedo crisis. Those reports were quietly filed away, and the officers responsible for the most egregious decisions retired with full honors. Nobody was court-martialed. Nobody publicly apologized. The Navy simply moved forward, incorporating the lessons learned into its institutional practices. What remained was the operational record. American submarines sank 1,178 Japanese merchant vessels, totaling over 5 million tons, representing 54% of all Japanese shipping losses from all causes during the war. They sank 201 Japanese naval vessels, including the aircraft carrier Shinano, the largest carrier ever built, and the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. The toll included 8 aircraft carriers, 1 battleship, 11 cruisers, and over 100 destroyers and submarines. They were the result of systematically identifying weapon defects, developing solutions, testing those solutions rigorously, and implementing them across the entire submarine force with ruthless efficiency. By 1945, American submarine warfare had been refined to a science. Intelligence from code-breaking operations provided convoy routes and schedules. Long-range patrol aircraft spotted targets and vectored submarines into position. The submarines themselves carried weapons that worked reliably and exploiters that could sink ships without requiring perfect shooting. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Fluckey's final war patrol in the summer of 1945 demonstrated just how far American submarine capability had evolved. Operating in the Sea of Okhotsk, north of Japan in waters the Japanese considered secure, Barb spent 43 days hunting targets with the patience of a professional predator. Fluckey attacked shipping in harbors, firing rockets from his deck guns at facilities on shore, even landing a demolition team that blew up a railroad train, the only ground combat action conducted by American submariners during the war. In that single patrol, Barb sank 15 ships totaling over 86,000 tons, more tonnage than most submarines sank in entire wartime careers. Fluckey fired 30 torpedoes, 28 equipped with Mark 18 exploiters. 26 achieved kills or significant damage. 2 were duds traced to manufacturing defects rather than design flaws. A 93% success rate under combat conditions against targets ranging from small coastal freighters to large tankers in heavily defended waters. The last ship Flucky sank on August 11, 1945, 2 days after the Nagasaki atomic bomb and 3 days before Japan announced surrender. There was a cargo vessel carrying rice from Korea to feed Japanese civilians. The torpedo struck beneath the keel, breaking the ship's back. She sank in minutes. Whether that final sinking affected anything strategically is questionable. Japan was already defeated, the surrender already decided. But it illustrated the complete reversal from December 1941, when American torpedoes barely worked and Japanese shipping operated with impunity. The human dimensions of this story extend beyond the statistics of ships sunk and tonnage destroyed. The submarine force suffered the highest casualty rate of any American military service, losing 52 boats and over 3,600 men, roughly 22% of all submariners who saw combat. These men operated in conditions that combined claustrophobia, constant danger, and the knowledge that if anything went wrong at depth, death would come quickly but not painlessly. For submarine crews, torpedo reliability wasn't an abstract technical question. It was the difference between completing your mission and dying when your attack failed and enemy escorts depth-charged you into oblivion. When torpedoes didn't work in 1942, boats had to close to suicidal ranges to guarantee hits, exposing themselves to Japanese anti-submarine forces. When torpedoes finally worked reliably in 1944, boats could attack from safer distances and withdraw before escorts could prosecute contacts effectively. The Mark 18 magnetic influence exploiter specifically saved lives by making attacks more efficient. Boats that would have needed to fire multiple spreads, exposing themselves for extended periods while reloading, could now fire single torpedoes and immediately clear the area. The tactical flexibility this provided meant submarine commanders could be more aggressive, engaging more targets and taking calculated risks that would have been suicidal with less reliable weapons. For Japanese merchant sailors and naval personnel, the Mark 18 meant death came without warning from impossible distances. A ship could be steaming along in water deemed too shallow for torpedo attacks, or too far from the last known submarine contact to pose immediate danger, and suddenly the keel would explode from beneath. The torpedo that killed you might have passed 50 feet from your hull, too far away for lookouts to spot its wake even if it had left one, which the improved Mark 14s with electric propulsion increasingly didn't. The psychological impact on Japanese crews was severe. By early 1945, experienced merchant sailors were refusing assignments because the mortality rate had become unacceptable. Ships would leave port with inexperienced crews, navigate poorly, fail to execute proper anti-submarine zigzag courses, and present even easier targets. The casualty rate among Japanese merchant sailors reached approximately 43%, meaning nearly half of all men who served aboard Japanese merchant ships during the war were killed. That's higher than the casualty rate for Japanese infantry on isolated Pacific islands or kamikaze pilots. The mathematical elegance of Tuve's solution deserves recognition. By actively generating a magnetic field and detecting the induced response rather than passively sensing ambient field changes, the Mark 18 exploiter solved multiple problems simultaneously. It eliminated dependence on local magnetic field conditions. It provided precise ranging information that prevented premature detonations. It distinguished between targets and debris with high reliability, and it did all this with analog electronics simple enough to be mass-produced by the thousands. Modern magnetic influence fusing systems, used in torpedoes, mines, and other naval weapons, still operate on fundamentally the same principles. Tuve established in 1943, the electronics are digital now instead of analog, the sensors are more sensitive, and the discrimination algorithms are more sophisticated. But the basic physics, generating a field and detecting the induced response, remains unchanged. That's the mark of genuinely fundamental innovation, solutions that remain valid across decades of subsequent technological advancement. The story of the Mark 18 also illustrates how warfare drives innovation in ways that peacetime research rarely matches. Tuve and his team developed functioning proximity fuses and magnetic influence exploiters in timelines that would be impossible in normal circumstances. They did it because the alternative was losing the war. Bureaucratic obstacles that would have delayed development for years in peacetime were simply bypassed. Testing protocols that would have required exhaustive validation were compressed into the minimum necessary to verify functionality. Production was scaled up while development was still ongoing, accepting the risk of manufacturing weapons that might need retrofitting. This compressed development cycle came with costs. Some early Mark 18 exploiters failed in the field due to issues that more extensive testing would have caught. Some torpedoes detonated prematurely or failed to fire when they should have, because the discrimination circuits weren't quite properly calibrated. But the overall success rate was high enough that these failures were acceptable losses compared to the alternative of waiting another year for a more refined design. The peacetime military-industrial complex that developed after World War II tried to systematize this rapid innovation cycle with mixed results. Weapons development programs grew increasingly complex, expensive, and slow as requirements expanded and testing protocols became more rigorous. The culture of acceptable risk that had allowed rapid development during the war gave way to risk-averse bureaucracies that prioritized avoiding failures over achieving breakthroughs. By the Vietnam War era, American weapons development timelines had stretched back to the 5 to 10-year ranges that had been normal before World War II, despite dramatically better technology and larger budgets. Whether this represents progress, more reliable weapons deployed with fewer field failures, or regression, slower response to emerging threats and missed opportunities for innovation, remains debatable. What's clear is that the combination of urgent necessity, adequate resources, talented personnel, and freedom from bureaucratic obstruction that characterized wartime weapons development proved difficult to replicate in peacetime environments. The final irony of the Mark 18's success involves the Mark 6 exploiter that had failed so catastrophically. Post-war analysis revealed that the Mark 6's fundamental concept wasn't actually wrong. The problem was implementation and testing. If the Mark 6 had been properly tested across a range of magnetic field conditions, if its sensitivity had been calibrated for operational environments rather than laboratory conditions, if submarine commanders had been properly trained on its limitations and optimal employment, it probably would have worked adequately. The Mark 18 succeeded not because Tuve invented entirely new physics, but because he approached an old problem with fresh thinking, rigorous testing in realistic conditions, and the willingness to discard assumptions that didn't work. The active magnetic field generation was clever, but the real innovation was in the systematic engineering process that ensured the device actually functioned as designed under combat conditions. Admiral Lockwood, reflecting on the torpedo crisis in his post-war memoirs, wrote that the greatest lesson learned wasn't technical, but organizational. Military institutions, he argued, needed to remain open to outside expertise, willing to acknowledge fundamental problems with existing systems, and capable of implementing solutions rapidly, even when those solutions contradicted established doctrine. The torpedo crisis had cost American submarines 2 years of reduced effectiveness and thousands of missed opportunities. The rapid deployment of the Mark 18, once its value was proven, demonstrated that the institutional capacity for innovation existed. It just needed to be properly directed. By the time Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, American submarines had effectively completed their mission. The Japanese merchant marine had been destroyed as an effective force. The Imperial Navy sat immobilized for lack of fuel. The home islands faced starvation from lack of imports. The economic foundation of Japan's ability to wage war had been systematically demolished by submarines that had transformed from nearly impotent in 1942 to overwhelmingly dominant in 1945. The weapon that made much of that transformation possible, Merle Tuve's magnetic influence exploiter, never received the public recognition given to more dramatic weapons like the atomic bomb or more visible platforms like aircraft carriers. It was classified for decades after the war. Technical details remained restricted, The engineers and physicists who developed it worked in obscurity, their contributions known only to small circles of specialists. But the submariners who used the Mark 18 in combat understood exactly what it meant. It meant being able to attack from safer distances and more favorable angles. It meant needing fewer torpedoes per target and being able to engage more ships per patrol. It meant higher success rates and lower risk exposure. For men whose lives depended on their weapons functioning when needed, the Mark 18 represented the difference between a fighting chance and a suicide mission. Eugene Fluckey, who'd trusted the mathematics of magnetic influence exploiters that morning in September 1944 and sunk 12 ships with 12 torpedoes as a result, received the Medal of Honor for his final war patrol. The citation mentioned his aggressive tactics, skilled seamanship, and dedication to his crew. It didn't mention that his success had been made possible by a physicist who'd built an impossible device in a basement laboratory and then proven the Navy's experts wrong. That's perhaps fitting. Wars aren't won by individual innovations, but by the cumulative effect of thousands of incremental improvements, each building on the others, each contributing to an overall capability that exceeds what any single development could achieve. The Mark 18 magnetic influence exploiter was one piece of a larger puzzle that included code-breaking intelligence, improved radar, better submarine designs, more sophisticated tactics, and the industrial capacity to produce weapons and platforms at scales Japan couldn't match. But it was a crucial piece. Without it, American submarines would have remained dependent on contact hits and would have needed to expose themselves to greater risks to achieve the same results. The submarine campaign that strangled Japan's war economy would have been less effective, taken longer, cost more American lives, and potentially extended the war into 1946 with consequences impossible to calculate. One mathematician's refusal to accept that passive magnetic detection was the only option, combined with the institutional willingness to let him pursue an alternative approach, produced a weapon that helped end the war in the Pacific. Not bad for a device the Bureau of Ordnance initially dismissed as impractical and unnecessary. The deeper lesson transcends the specific technology, or even the specific war. Complex problems sometimes have elegant solutions that require questioning fundamental assumptions. Institutional expertise can be wrong, not from stupidity or incompetence, but from overinvestment in existing approaches that prevents consideration of alternatives. And innovation requires not just technical brilliance, but the organizational space and support to pursue ideas that don't fit established frameworks. Merle Tuve understood this intuitively. When the Navy told him magnetic exploiters couldn't work reliably, he didn't argue about whether the Mark 6 could be fixed. He built something entirely different that solved the underlying problem in a new way. When the Bureau of Ordnance suggested his approach would take years to develop, he demonstrated a working prototype in months. When they claimed it wouldn't work under combat conditions, he arranged field testing that proved it would. That pattern of demonstrating rather than debating, of building prototypes rather than writing reports, of letting results speak for themselves, characterized the most successful weapons development programs of World War II. It's a pattern that remains relevant today, perhaps more so given how much more complex and expensive modern weapons systems have become, and how much institutional inertia resists genuine innovation. The submariners who survived the war because their torpedoes actually worked, the Japanese civilians who starved because ships carrying food couldn't reach the home islands, the war that ended in August 1945 rather than extending into 1946, all were affected by decisions made in laboratories and offices, far from combat zones by people whose names history largely forgot. That's the nature of technological warfare. The battles are fought by sailors and soldiers, but the outcomes are often determined by engineers and scientists who never fired a shot. Understanding how wars are really won requires looking beyond the dramatic battles and heroic actions to the grinding technical realities that determine whether your weapons work better than the enemy's, whether your logistics can sustain operations longer than theirs can, whether your industrial base can outproduce theirs. In the Pacific War, American submarines equipped with Mark 18 magnetic influence exploiters proved that technical superiority, once achieved, could be devastating and decisive. The weapon that shouldn't exist, developed by a mathematician the Navy initially ignored, became the silent killer that helped strangle an empire. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.